In the heart of an ancient realm, beneath a sky that seemed to hold the weight of 1,000 untold secrets, there reigned a king who was obsessed with the mysteries of the night. His kingdom, though vast and prosperous, was shadowed by an eerie tension that gripped its very soul. The palace itself was a maze of golden corridors and dark chambers, each adorned with velvet drapes that fluttered like whispers of forgotten dreams. In every corner, dream interpreters wandered, their eyes vacant but filled with purpose, all hoping to unlock the cryptic visions that haunted the monarch. One morning, the king awoke with a sudden gasp, his heart racing in his chest. His breath was shallow, and his body trembled as a vision lingered in his mind. A vision so vivid, it felt as if it had reached into the deepest corners of his soul. He saw himself standing alone in a vast, barren field, surrounded by nothing but desolation. The air was heavy, suffocating, and his mouth was dry. The most unsettling part of the vision, however, was the single, unyielding tooth in his mouth. No other sign, no other symbol, just that haunting image that felt like a curse in his very bones. Disturbed and unnerved, the king summoned his council immediately, a cloud of incense rising to mask the tension in the room. His voice was strained as he shared the disturbing vision. The room grew thick with anticipation, but not a single soul dared to speak. His trusted seers, who had deciphered countless omens before, were now rendered speechless. Their faces were pale, and their hands trembled as if the very weight of the king's dream had trapped them in a web of silence. The dream's meaning was elusive, slipping through their fingers like sand, and the king's frustration began to mount. The atmosphere in the chamber grew heavy with unease. The silence stretched on, suffocating the men and women who had always been so sure of their prophetic abilities. The king, desperate for answers, slammed his fist against the stone table. His voice quivered with a mixture of anger and fear as he demanded clarity. "What does this vision mean?" he bellowed, the words sharp like a blade. His voice echoed throughout the chamber, but no one dared to answer. The dream hung in the air, a riddle wrapped in the enigma of the night's shadow. Word of the king's unsettling dream spread like wildfire through the kingdom, whispered through the streets, and echoed in the taverns. It was a story that grew more sinister with each retelling, stirring fears and uncertainties in the hearts of those who heard it. In a distant kingdom, where the mist never seemed to lift and the rivers murmured in forgotten tongues, lived a sage. He was known far and wide for his ability to decipher the language of dreams, for he understood that the universe often spoke in riddles, its messages hidden in the folds of the night. Upon hearing of the king's plight, he set out on a journey, drawn by an instinctive pull, as if the very stars had called him. Days passed, and the sage's journey was fraught with peril. The path was treacherous, winding through ancient forests where the trees seemed to whisper secrets of their own. The sage pressed forward, guided only by the faint glimmer of distant light that pierced the thick canopy above. With each step, the forest seemed to grow darker, the shadows stretching longer, as though the earth itself was trying to keep him from reaching his destination. Yet he pressed on, for he knew that he had been chosen to unravel this royal mystery. Upon arriving at the palace, the sage was greeted with a cold reception. The king, who had been consumed by his haunting dreams, eyed the sage with suspicion, though he could not deny the man's aura of wisdom. The sage's eyes gleamed with a quiet knowledge, his very presence commanding respect. He listened attentively as the king recounted the dream, his voice laced with frustration and fear. The sage's expression remained unreadable, but his mind churned with ancient knowledge, weaving through the strands of the dream like a masterful weaver. When the sage finally spoke, his voice was calm and deliberate, a stark contrast to the king's frantic demeanor. "Your Majesty," he said, each word measured and profound, "the dream you have witnessed is not merely a vision. It is a warning. It speaks of the fall of all that you hold dear. You will stand alone, a sentinel in a world of ruins, abandoned by time and those who once served you." The words hung in the air like a thick fog, and the king's face drained of color. A chill ran down his spine as the full weight of the prophecy settled in his bones. His pulse quickened, and his hands clenched into fists, trembling with a mixture of anger and disbelief. The king's anger flared as the sage spoke. How could this stranger speak such dreadful words? How dare he predict the ruin of his kingdom, his legacy? The thought of being alone, abandoned in the face of his greatest fears, was unbearable. Without thinking, the king snapped his fingers, and guards rushed forward, seizing the sage with swift hands. The man's protests were calm, almost serene, but it made no difference. He was dragged away, his prophecy still hanging over the king like a dark cloud, and the king was left to grapple with his own spiraling thoughts. As the sage was thrown into the dungeon, the king's proclamation echoed across the kingdom. A reward was promised to anyone who could interpret his nightmare and transform it into something hopeful. Dreamers, seers, and charlatans flocked to the castle, eager to claim the riches promised by the king. Each interpretation was more colorful than the last, some filled with honeyed words and promises of greatness. But as the days passed, the king grew more and more disillusioned. None of the answers offered gave him any peace. The sage's prophecy gnawed at his soul, refusing to let him rest. On the seventh day, when the king was beginning to lose all hope, a young man appeared at the palace gates. His presence was unassuming, his clothes plain, yet there was something in his eyes, something that suggested he knew the hidden truths of the world. He approached the king, his steps sure, his voice calm, yet filled with conviction. "Great king," he said, bowing respectfully, "I believe your dream is not a prophecy of doom, but of renewal. It is the beginning of something new, a reign that will endure beyond the ages, where your wisdom will guide you through the storm, and your legacy will outlast your rivals." The king's heart skipped a beat. The words of this young man, though echoing the earlier ominous prophecy, carried a strange, comforting energy. The king's eyes, once clouded with fear, now shimmered with a hint of hope. Could it be true? Could the end he feared truly be the beginning of something greater? The young man's voice was like a breath of fresh air, a glimmer of light piercing through the fog of despair that had enveloped the king's soul. For the first time in days, the king felt a spark of something other than dread, something that resembled hope. With a wave of his hand, the king dismissed his doubts. He commanded that treasures be laid before the young visionary, riches beyond measure. The king's eyes glinted with both gratitude and uncertainty as he watched the young man bow and accept his reward. The king's decision to trust in this new interpretation, to believe that something positive could come from the dream, was a rare moment of vulnerability. But as the young man departed, the king felt the subtle weight of his own choice, the responsibility of believing in something unknown. However, as the young man exited the palace, something even more significant occurred. He crossed paths with the imprisoned sage in the dim corridors of the dungeon. Their eyes met, a brief but profound exchange. The young man's gaze spoke of understanding, while the sage's expression held the quiet knowledge of a man who had seen the truth but knew its value in patience. The silent conversation that passed between them was more powerful than any spoken word. The sage nodded ever so slightly, acknowledging the young man's ability to speak the truth with gentleness, an art that would carry great weight in the future. The king's chambers, once filled with dark whispers of doom, now felt lighter, the air less oppressive. Yet even as the king began to breathe more freely, he found himself endlessly contemplating the words of the sage. As he pondered the enigmatic message, the king realized that the true power of prophecy lay not in its raw truth, but in the delivery of its meaning. The sage's harsh words had been a bitter medicine, and the young man's gentle interpretation had transformed it into a remedy. The king now saw that wisdom could be delivered not with a sword, but with a gentle hand, not with fear, but with hope. Over the next few days, the king reflected deeply, his mind adrift with the realization that his power could not solely rely on the weight of authority. He began to wander the palace halls alone during twilight, pondering the nature of leadership. His mind churned with thoughts of his dreams, now no longer visions of despair, but cryptic messages waiting to be unlocked. The king found himself captivated by the idea of dreams, both his own and those of his people. Dreams, he now understood, were far more than mere illusions. They were gateways to understanding, to a deeper connection with the world around him. Meanwhile, the sage, locked away in his cold dungeon cell, was unaware of the subtle changes taking place in the king's heart. But in the darkness, the sage's smile grew wider, not from vindication, but from an understanding that the kingdom would not fall. The young man, by transforming the prophecy, had given the king the one thing he lacked: hope. As the sage's prison cell grew quieter, his spirit seemed lighter, knowing that the seeds of wisdom had been planted in the king's heart, even if they had sprouted in unexpected ways. One evening, as the kingdom's seasons shifted, the king, his face now weathered by the weight of his thoughts, ordered the sage to be brought before him once again. The sage, his beard now longer, his eyes deeper, stood before the king, no longer as a prisoner, but as a teacher. The change in the king was undeniable. His eyes were no longer clouded with suspicion, but open with curiosity. "Forgive me," the king said, his voice laden with genuine remorse, "for the harshness I showed you. I see now that true wisdom often comes from the shadows of misunderstanding." The sage nodded, his voice calm and understanding. "It is not the harshness that matters, my king, but the lesson that follows." With that, they began to walk together through the royal gardens, where the air smelled of fresh blossoms and the paths were lit by the soft glow of lanterns. The sage spoke of dreams and their many layers, how they were often veiled in metaphor, how their meanings shifted depending on the eyes that looked upon them. The king listened intently, his mind expanding as he began to truly understand the nature of his visions. As they strolled, the king felt a weight lifting from his shoulders. He realized that his fear of the unknown had held him captive, had made him blind to the deeper meanings hidden in his dreams. Now, with the sage's guidance, the king learned to see beyond the surface, to explore the hidden layers of his own thoughts and feelings. With every step, the king felt a sense of peace he had never known before. As if he were walking through a door to a new world, one that was shaped by understanding rather than fear. Under this newfound wisdom, the kingdom flourished. The king, once a ruler isolated by his nightmares, now ruled with a balance of wisdom and compassion. His subjects felt a shift in the air, a subtle yet profound transformation. They saw in him not just a king, but a man who had learned to listen, not just to his people, but to his own soul. The kingdom, once shadowed by uncertainty, now glowed with hope, each citizen walking with the knowledge that their king understood them. It was a time of peace, a time of growth, and a time of dreams realized. One night, beneath the canopy of stars, the king hosted a grand feast in honor of both the sage and the young man. The hall was filled with laughter, music, and the rich aroma of food. The tables were overflowing with the bounty of the harvest. But there was something more, the intangible sense of unity that hung in the air. As the king raised his glass, his eyes met those of his guests, and he spoke of the power of words, of dreams, and of the journeys that had led them all to this moment. The sage, sitting at the king's side, shared stories of faraway lands where dreams were seen as bridges to the divine. The young man listened intently, his mind already alight with new ideas, his future still unwritten but full of promise. The king, seeing the spark in his eyes, knew that the young man's journey had just begun. As the night drew on, the king offered him a position at court, an opportunity to continue his work of interpreting dreams and guiding the kingdom with the wisdom he had already shared.